Hi, Joanna.
Hi, how are
Well,
you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Well, um, having been told yesterday I needed to do this, I'm doing fine.
Well, you're always
I didn't say needed to do it. I asked if you would be willing to do it.
Right.
weren't you a Girl Scout and you're always prepared, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I had to do some stuff, but so Rick, I'm just going to say next, so you'll have to listen closely.
yes, please. I have it ready to go.
I don't know what my screen used to show like 16 or 20 people, and now it's only showing 6. I don't know why.
In the upper right in view, is it still galleried?
I did that and it didn't do it.
Interesting.
If you click on participants, Joanna, you'll see on the list of participants are 17 people. Just most of us have our cameras off.
Oh, it only shows the people with cameras on?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see.
So, yeah, if you click on participants, it'll expand the list and you can see
I
everybody.
see. Okay. Well, that's okay. I just wondered because I used to, when I had class, I could see everybody. Okay.
We'll wait just a couple more minutes for people to move on in.
Welcome, Jocelyn. And I see Aaron White from DOE. Looks like Betsy Fornash is joining.
Yes,
Glad
and I
y'all
just
could
want to
join us.
say thank you, and I'm so sorry we had to switch up a last-minute speaker for the event. But Joanna is a great, a speaker, so you guys are really going to enjoy that. We've enjoyed our partnership with CRESP for many years, so we'll definitely look forward to rescheduling the EM 101. So more to come on that, but we're so happy that you're able to find another presentation for this slot. So thank you.
Well, during COVID, things have to be shifted and changed periodically. We're in a new world. I assume we're waiting for something.
Yeah, I was just waiting the last just about 3 after till the for people to all move in, but I think we'll go ahead and get started. So today, we're welcome to have an honor to have Dr. Joanna Berger presenting for us. Thank you for taking time, especially last minute, to come and meet with us here. Dr. Berger has a background in biology and vertebrate zoology and science education before achieving her doctorate in behavioral ecology and evolution. She also achieved a postdoc and eventually a distinguished professorship at Rutgers. Her current work is as an ecologist, studying everything from individual species all the way up through pathway analysis and ecosystems, specifically looking at heavy metal exposure and effects, temporal analysis, and focus on food chain relationships. So with that being said, I'd like to pass it over to you, Dr. Berger. Thank you once again for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's always fun to talk about these things. It's also always nice to see how different people view what your career has been. So that's always fun. Hi, everybody. And Rick, if you could turn it on. I'm actually, I don't know if you can hear it in the background, there's a lot of laughing gulls calling. I'm actually in the field, so I don't have high-speed internet. I'm barely getting this. And so Rick is going to go forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about studies with American Indians and Alaskan Natives and as collaborators, because I think now, why doesn't it fill the whole screen? Rick, can you make it fill the whole screen so it's bigger? It was initially, and then it went to small for some odd reason.
Rick, if you go to the top where it says display settings and switch which screen on the top.
Yeah, you're on presenter mode instead of presentation mode.
That's fine. Do that. There
Oh,
you go.
that's much better. Okay, next. So one of the really important, next, Rick, one of the really important messages, maybe he can't hear me. Rick, can you hear me? Next slide. Okay. Okay. One of the key messages of the whole talk is that it's really important to remember that stakeholder or community involvement is key to working in any situation. And you need to remember that many Indian tribes, not all, but many Indian tribes have sovereign nation status. And that means that at the higher levels, it has to be a government to government interaction. Although at the technical level, we can work with other technical people within tribes, but we always need to remember that in many cases it's government to government, and that they feel, as do many communities, some ownership of the data in whatever you work with. And I believed for 30 years that it's really important to conduct studies together, interpret results together, and publish results together. Next. So I'm going to briefly talk about some different ways of thinking about how you work with Native American tribes and Alaskan Natives. And one of the first things to start with is trying to understand the differences in viewpoints. Now, there are differences in viewpoints among lots of different people, but it's particularly important to understand the difference between Native Americans and Caucasians, who often view things from a utilitarian viewpoint instead of a complete ecological viewpoint. So early on, we did several studies where we looked at and asked people what they thought about different things. And what we found that is often, in many cases, Native Americans were both using consumptive things, fish and wildlife, more heavily than were others, but also they really were much more interested in the other aspects of ecology, the natural aspects, the aesthetic aspects. Next. So we did some things with Native Americans in the East near Tennessee, where we actually asked them how much they fished and hunted and whether or not they used that food. And I particularly worked with a tribe in Tennessee because we don't usually think of Native American tribes in the East. We mostly think of them at the West, but it's important to remember that all of North America was inhabited by American Indians and that they deserve to be considered. Next. So, and we did similar things at INL, comparing Native American views with respect to consumption and non-consumptive things. And what we found, whether we looked in the East or the West in general, is that Native Americans were having higher rates of consumption of fish and game, and also of herbs and other things that they could collect in the wild than did the Caucasian people in the same place. And so this was important to establish right at the start, that there are differences in the way people view things. And it's important to understand first how people view things before you start working more with them. Next. And one of the important things to think about is that we often do use different terms in different ways. So when you look at any consumptive activities and any non-consumptive activities, you often find that any consumptive activities, which means collecting herbs or fish or hunting, things like that, Native Americans have much higher rates, and that means they're eating more, and it often means that they're therefore exposed to more contaminants if they are in the fish and game. But non-consumptive activities are often the same, and that means hiking and camping and all of those activities. What is striking, however, is that Native Americans often think of them as together, that when they go hunting, it's part of camping, when they go fishing, it's part of enjoying the outdoors and hiking and so on. They're not sort of considered as separate activities. The same thing is true in thinking of terminology. If you ask people if they go to church, Caucasians are going to say more, but if you ask Native Americans, if they go to sacred places, they are obviously going to much more. So we have to remember that we use different terms for different things, and it doesn't mean that the same feelings and attributes aren't equally important. Next. So one of the things I think with respect to looking at consumption patterns that's really important is that tribes are often put in a real dilemma. That is, they had traditional tribal consumption rates that their ancestors might have consumed 50 or 100 years ago in terms of their culture and what they were normally consuming. Some of those consumption rates have been drastically reduced because of contaminants, either contaminants from Department of Energy sites, contaminants from coal fire burning plants, which means mercury exposure, and have therefore had to reduce their consumption rates. Having reduced consumption rates, however, often DOE sites and others conduct risk assessments based on current consumption rates. And that presents a dilemma because the consumption rates were already reduced because of the contamination. And then if you assume that you're going to clean up only to the safety level of those consumption rates, the traditional tribal lifestyle can never really be restored because it's circular. And this was something that we discussed a lot, particularly with the Nez Perce and Idaho, and with the other tribes at Hanford, particularly the Yakima and Russell Jim, bless his heart, who has now departed us. But this is a really important aspect of thinking about tribal views, whether they're Native Alaskans or Native Americans. Next. So in other words, we really needed to think about the fact that there has been, up until the last few years, a kind of Western view of natural resources, which was mostly what did we get from nature, fish, game, and what services do we get? Camping, clean air, clean water, hiking, all those things. Those things are true of Native American desires also, although they might view them differently, they're doing them also. But they also have a more reverent, in many ways, view of landscapes and buildings. When I say buildings, I'm not talking about skyscrapers in New York City, but sacred grounds and what might be there. And landscapes, natural resources, which we call kind of ecocultural attributes. These are the ecological attributes that are essential for any activity to be considered whole. So for many Native Americans to go hunting or fishing in a place that is despoiled by nuclear reactors or some other buildings decreases their appreciation of the experience, and therefore doesn't make the experience what it always used to be. And we have to be sensitive to those things. Some people can ignore the presence of a building more than others in terms of their total response to that building. Next. Next. Rick, next. I don't know, can he hear me? Julie, can you move these forward?
I cannot. Oop.
Oh,
So now we seem to have lost it altogether.
Apologies.
It's like you froze up there. So
I
you
did
probably
too.
lost-
One,
Rick,
so
can you
it's
put it back?
reconnecting. Yes.
I think it
So I
dropped
thought
off,
I was
Joanna.
the-
I think he's having,
I thought I was the one with the bad connection, but maybe it's Vanderbilt
Hold on.
that's having the bad connection. Anyway, I think it's really important for us to always be aware of how differences among different groups of people, whether you're talking about environmental justice communities in terms of low income Black or brown communities, or Native Alaskans or Native Americans. And I'm going to illustrate some of these points by talking about a project that we did a while ago in the Aleutians, where I consider that it's traditional knowledge meets science in the Aleutians. And I think we have to remember that traditional knowledge is science. It's just science knowledge that's been derived over a longer period of time. These three pictures were taken in the Aleutians. On the left is a fisherman, a young fisherman who was 18 and just sort of bringing back all the fish for his village. And it's the job of the young people to make sure they bring enough food back for all of the elders. And on the other side, there's a woman preparing the fish. Next. So we did a project at Amchitka, which is in the red here. And you might say, where is Amchitka and why does anyone care about it? Well, there's Alaska and there's Russia, and the Aleutian chain goes out from Alaska. And the US Department of Energy conducted 3 underground nuclear tests there between 1965 and 1971. And none after that. And immediately after the test shots, they did test the safety of some of the foods around the island, but did not do anything since that time. But they wanted to close it in 1999, and the native Alaskans, Aleuts, objected, saying they didn't know if their foods were safe. Alaska objected, the US Fish and Wildlife Service objected, and NOAA objected. So we ended up doing a study there next, which there's a lot of background about it, but basically what it came down to is that DOE had conducted a very expensive and extensive human health risk assessment and a groundwater model. But for many people, me included, models that cost a lot of money, but which are not understandable to the general public, are not very persuasive. And if you begin to actually look at the assumptions they used, some of the assumptions were not what people living there would agree with. The consumption rate, for example, they used, one of them was what a typical American would eat. Now, I can tell you, having gotten stranded on these islands, that I ate fish morning, noon, and night, because the supermarkets function only for a couple of weeks every time the boat comes with food, but otherwise you have to eat what's available. So it's of some concern to the Alaskan natives that the models and the food actually are safe and they can know that. So what happened is, this is kind of a diagram of the underground nuclear tests. And there's always the possibility that something from the test shot could come out either in the deep water or the benthic zone or the intertidal zone. And so next, we developed a science plan to satisfy the needs of many, many different types of stakeholders and the Alaska Native tribes. There were 3 shots, and you don't need to worry about them, but suffice it to say, they were deep, but they were very strong. Next. So I think the important thing to remember, from my perspective, is that participatory research really means that. It means that you are including whoever you're dealing with, whoever your research subjects are and what you're doing for them, that you include them so that they have equal say in how the research is done, how it's connected. This just shows you to start. Did somebody have a question? This just shows you to start that it's important to include them throughout. Karen Pletnikoff was then sort of a very high person in the Aleut Pribilof Island Association. Next. So when you think about stakeholders, and you need to recognize, first of all, that the Aleuts are tribal people, and so are stakeholders in one sense, but are sovereign nations in another. So the Aleut Pribilof Island Association really wanted to know if the foods were safe, and they wanted their cultural values maintained. They wanted to know that it was safe to hunt and fish. The state of Alaska was interested in marine resources, and for human health, the US Fish and Wildlife Service was interested in mammal resources. NOAA was interested in fish stocks and marine mammals, but mainly in fish stocks, because almost half of our food in the lower fish from the lower 48 states comes from the Bering Sea. where Amchitka is located. So there was a lot of interest in this, even though not much attention had been given to it. The attention was given to it when DOE wanted to close the site and walk away, and people suddenly said, how do we know it hasn't leaked? Next. So there was a very complicated process, and CRESP got involved because CRESP had early on done a study at the Savannah River site looking at mercury exposure in fish, and looking at, in that case, it was white communities and Black communities that lived along the river. Savannah River initially said there was nobody fishing in the Savannah River, and we did a study of fish consumption rates, interviewing people along the river, using local interviewers, and it turns out people actually eat a lot of fish from the Savannah River. And so we did a study where we both interviewed people to find out what they ate, and looked at the mercury levels, mostly done with the help of local people. And so the state of Alaska asked CRESP if we could come in and do a similar study. That's how we got there. Next. So this is what I meant by what DOE had done to begin with. DOE is a responsible party, and so they conducted a groundwater model in 1995, and they involved a lot of people in designing the groundwater model to begin with, and they conducted a screening risk assessment, and they thought that those two would be sufficient to develop a long-term stewardship plan for the closure of Alaska. And as I mentioned, none of the people in the group above under stakeholders were actually very happy with either one of them. So next. So when the governor of Alaska asked the secretary of DOE to have CRESP come in, we came in, and what I want to illustrate by the blue is that you can add a whole nother layer of everyone who really is affected by this being involved. So CRESP developed a research plan, and that research plan went back to all the stakeholders to look at and think about. Next. And they wanted to just close it with the two models. And so that we developed a plan to start out with that was also reviewed by the state of Alaska and US Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA and DOE and everybody. But after we developed the plan, Mike and I, two CRESP people, went back to the individual villages. We went to Dutch Harbor, and then we went to Atkin, we went to Nikolsky, we went to several different villages with the science plan, and presented it to the elders of each village, and discussed with the elders how or what they would like to see and how they would like to see it changed. And then had meetings with everyone in the village. And many of these villages had only 39 people or 79 people, 110 people. We're talking about small groups of people. And then in one of the villages, the kids came to me and said, well, gee, we would like to have a meeting. And so we had meetings with the children in the villages, and almost everybody came to the meetings. All the kids came. They were incredibly interesting and provided a lot of information. And as a result of those meetings, we changed our plan, and we brought 4 Aleuts with us on the expedition. And we also changed what species we collected. Next. So this is a general food chain thing we don't have to concentrate a lot on, but just that in places like Amchitka Island, which is not inhabited, but the other islands that do have Alaska Natives living there, they are really completely dependent upon the surrounding environments. The Twinkies only come 4 times a year on a boat, if the boat can get there. When I went to all the villages, what I took were oranges and apples, which were really what people craved because it was very hard for them to get fresh fruit and vegetables. Next. And in turn, they fed me fish for 7 days when I got stranded there. So at every point, we had the Native Alaskans and Alaskan Natives as part of everything we did, developing the plan, changing the plan, approving the plan, and going on the expedition. Next. So our missions really were safety, subsistence, science, and society. We really wanted to make sure everybody was safe on the expedition, make sure that we included the subsistence foods as well as the commercial fish. And so whenever we went on any island, I had 3 divers, I had 3 biologists trained in sampling, and I had 4 Aleuts and a logistics person and a doctor person, so that we were safe. And whenever we went to an island, the biological team would collect the samples the way anybody would who's doing a biological study, by having transects and collecting them a certain way and so on. And I told the Aleuts to collect whatever they would eat if they were stranded on that island, so that we were sure that we were collecting what was important to them, regardless of whether it was what we might have thought to collect in the first place. Next. This is just to tell you that we had Aleuts at every point. And there were 2 parts of the expedition. I was the head of the biological part. David Cosson was the head of the geophysical part. And we each had several weeks on this. We rented a great big fishing trawler and went out to do the work. Next. And so the expedition was, the biological one, took up the 28th of June till the 21st of July. And I also put somebody, the person who's by themselves, on a NOAA ship so that he could collect samples from the actual NOAA expedition, which was collecting what people eat in the lower 48. So those were the commercial species. Next. So this is what the first objectives were. Are the foods safe? Is the biota currently contaminated? And are the levels of radionuclides high enough to pose harm? And what are the current risks, and what species are appropriate for long-term monitoring? Because remember, the objective was for DOE to get to a point where they could turn over the land to the state of Alaska or the US Fish and Wildlife Service and do what we call closure, even though DOE is always responsible for the radionuclides. This is just to show that on Atka Island, the Alaskan natives, the Aleuts, trying to set up a commercial fishery, much like they have in Dutch Harbor. Next. So we started out with a whole list of species that we were going to collect, and added some, like sea urchin and octopus, basket star, were added by the Aleuts in the individual village. Chitons and mussels were added in limpets. So there were a lot of, this is a combination of what I would collect as a Western scientist and what Aleuts would collect as traditional scientists. Yes, next. And so when we went places, we had transects, as you can see in blue, from each of the main shots, the underground nuclear test shots. We collected samples offshore from each one of those, both on land and in the water. The divers dove almost every day, collecting samples, and we were on land collecting other kinds of samples, and the Aleuts were out collecting their samples at all times. Next. And we used Kiska Island as a control, which is another island in the same thing. So here we collected a lot of samples. We brought back 38 coolers full, and we had a lab in the lowest floor of the ship, which you'll call whatever deck it is. But anyway, we had designed a lab there so that we could take large fish and just take the samples that we needed, because look at those Pacific cod there. I mean, if we brought back all the Pacific cod that we collected, we simply would not have any room at all. We just couldn't bring everything back. So we had a lab downstairs and worked in the evening to compress the samples. And we had 38 coolers full of samples, and we came back weighing almost 2,500 pounds. And then the person on the NOAA boat had 10 coolers as well. This is one of my Aleuts and the gulls he collected. Gulls are very common, and they actually eat gull eggs in the right season. It's considered a delicacy. So that gull eggs were one of the things that were added after visits with the Aleuts. Next. So this just gives you kind of a feel for some of the things we did. So in the upper left is one of my Aleut guys who's collected Dolly Varden, which are fish that breed in the lake that was created when one of the underground nuclear tests exploded underground and had the effect of actually creating on the surface a deep lake, which is still there from 1971. So those fish go into that during that time. We took many different samples. On the right is a picture of me with a bird that they collect and eat all the time, and they collect their eggs. And the bottom are my divers. And then on the bottom left are the biological team who used wetsuits to collect some of the things in the intertidal zone. Next. So I put the, there was a lot of data. There's like 8 or 10 papers that came from this, and I'm not going to bore you with all those results. But I put this slide in just to show you that many of the different samples that we collected were collected at many different depths, so that the biological team, the person shown on the bottom of the picture, collected a lot of things in the intertidal out to the place where the divers were fishing. So that rough-eye rockfish at the top, those little fish can live to be 100. I mean, they're small fish, cold water, and they live for a very long time. So this just shows you that things were caught at very different depths, and we tried to make sure that we covered the different depths so that if radionuclides had leaked at different points, it might be obvious. Next. One of the things that we were really interested in, and the Aleuts were really interested in, is whether or not the things that they would collect in their traditional methods would be similar to the sizes and species that we would collect as scientists, or that they would get on the trawler. And by this is just size length. And by and large, it's not always the case, but by and large, size of fish is a good indication of contaminants, along with age for any given fish that would be. So for these 3 fish, rockfish, Atka mackerel, and some of the Atka mackerel we caught were like 100 years old, and Pacific cod, you can see that there was no differences in what we collected by our rigorous transect sampling, what the Aleuts collected, and the way that they would collect it as Aleut hunters, and in the NOAA trawl. So that was very rewarding in the end. And that paper where we talk about this, the Aleuts are on it along with the rest of us next as authors. So this shows you what we did in terms of dealing with the samples once we came back. We were interested in doing a human health screen using strontium 90, actinides, and gamma, and then a broad gamma analysis of the food chain. And we did some interlaboratory analyses, just as you should do. And so we were using foods as bioindicators, additional samples. And one of the I'm really compulsive about these things. So we had initially determined at the start that we should be able to use, I think it was 100 grams. We thought we should be able to use and get adequate radionuclide analyses done. But in the end, after we ran some samples just initially to figure out how to do it, we had to do a much larger sample size. So one of the things to learn from this is whatever you think you're going to need as a sample size, you have to collect more to make sure that you're going to be able to get some analyses, because you need to get some values so you know whether they're higher or lower. So we ended up using much bigger samples than we intended in the first place, but I had collected a lot more samples, so we had enough to do that. Next. So INL did our analysis because it was really important to have the analysis all done one place and look at it. And as I say, this is where we started with 100 grams. We were getting too many non-detects, so we went to 1,000 grams and 72 hours. And we're looking at human health risks for bioindicators and for Aleut food safety at different levels of the food chain. And we did a lot of different things. We did cod. Alaria is an algae that can get to be 20, 30 feet long. Eagle, we had one sea lion, I'll talk about that in a minute, that was not part of our plan. but we had permits from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take eagles. That required the Secretary of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to sign off on it, which he did, and halibut and octopus. And so we collected at many different trophic levels to try to make sure that we would be sure in the end whether or not there was a risk to humans and the environment. Next. So what were we interested in? Our overall question for radionuclides was, what are the overall levels? What are the differences among species? What are the differences between the radionuclide levels in Amchitka and Kiska, which was the control? What were the differences between the test shots? Were there any? And then to look at the levels, compare them to the 1970 levels and to other regions of the world, and then to effects levels. So we had a lot of different levels of analyses we wanted to do and comparisons. Next. So the importance really is what we said. Are the food safe? Is the biota contaminated? And how does the biological diversity compare? Because another effect could be if there were low levels of radiation that affected biota, some biota might not be at Amchitka that should be there. That's why we needed a control site. And then lastly, what species are appropriate for biomonitoring? Because if they succeeded in closing Amchitka, it would go to long-term stewardship in DOE that would be responsible for the radionuclides and perpetuity. And they would need to know, using our data, what they should be monitoring in the future. Next. So this just shows that we had people out diving, our Aleuts, that's the big octopus that one of our people, Aleuts, got, and here's some fishermen. And this is in our lower deck. We were preparing samples at night. Next. Trying to give you a feel for it. Now, the one thing that came up during this, which was tricky, was the Aleuts came to me and said, it's all right as Alaskan natives to do seal hunting or sea lion hunting. And I said, well, I don't have a collecting permit and we can't do that under my collecting permit. So there were discussions with NOAA. Charles Powers, who was running CRESP at that time, had some discussions with NOAA, and it was ultimately decided that they did have this right and that we couldn't tell them they couldn't have this right. So they went and the two older Aleuts who had done this before went and to a village, to a sea lion colony. Next. Now, as non-native people, we did not touch this at all. So the Aleuts themselves had to do the butchering, which they did on shore, and then they brought the samples back to the boat. I mean, they were killing it not for us, they were killing it for their village. And we had enough freezer space so they could take the meat back to their villages. Next. I will say one thing about the sea lion hunt that was really interesting. I took a lot of pictures and they took a lot of pictures, which we gave to them. And when we went back later after this expedition was over, the one thing they wanted to see was the pictures from the sea lion hunt, because women and children never go on these and they never get to see them and they never get to see what it's like. And they were just thrilled that they could see some of these things. But anyway, back to this. So we had one sea lion because later, ultimately, the Aleuts sent some of the meat to the University of Alaska Museum in Anchorage, and they sent some seal meat to us and asked us to analyze it, which we did. But all the rest there are the samples that we collected under permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state of Alaska. So we had octopus, we only could get 4. And I must say it was quite hard for the Aleuts to get them, but they were perfect in knowing how to get all these things. And so this just shows what percentage of the samples we had detects. And it was really important for us to increase the sample size to 1,000 grams in order to make sure that we did in fact get detects, so that this wasn't an issue. And you can see that with some species, gulls, we had to combine lots of individuals to get an analysis. So that's something to remember, that you can analyze eggs, for example, one egg at a time as you would for metals because there's not enough material. Next. So when we just looked at the values, the mean becquerels per kilogram, it's what you might imagine, that gulls are lower on the food chain and longer lived fish like halibut are higher, and sea lion was the highest. Next. So when we looked at compared the same fish species that had been examined in 67, 68 after the tests, you can see that they're all lower than they were at that time. And that was very rewarding for the local people as well as DOE and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Next. You know, I have a lot of papers about this, and anybody who's particularly interested, I can send you them. The next thing we did was compare Anchitka to the North Sea in Norway, which would be an appropriate site to compare them to. Next. And you can see that the Irish Sea had, and these were all recent analyses, not ones from a long time ago. You can see that the samples that we collected at Anchitka were all lower generally than were the ones either in the Irish Sea or other sites. So Anchitka is not posing a different risk. Here's a picture of an Atka mackerel, which is sometimes yellow and sometimes red, which was really intriguing to me. It's a beautiful fish. That little thing's 100 years old. Next. And this is an algae that we looked at, and I put it in only so that you can see, but these are actually eaten by the Japanese and by Aleuts and other people as well. And you can see that when you look at Anchitka, it's as low as the other places and much lower than the Irish Sea. Next. This is the same thing for mussels and cod. And again, this shows mussels being taken off of a rock by divers. And you can see that, in fact, they're much lower. Next. So I think this is really important to think about this. We had lots of dialogues with everybody. We presented results to everybody. And unlike most studies, we actually went back to all the native villages we went to, Atka and Nikolsky, and presented to them as well. And they were really amazed because nobody ever came back and told them what they'd found. So they really loved it. In fact, the Aleuts on our expedition, I had gotten everybody small cameras, everybody on the expedition. This was just the beginning of digital age. And I got everybody on the expedition a digital camera. And so everybody took pictures. And when the Aleuts got back to their villages, they make a calendar every year for the Aleutians. And a lot of the pictures from the expedition, they put on the calendar. So this was another way that the Aleuts themselves sort of participated and had some ownership of what was going on, because their people had been there, collected the pictures, collected the samples, and were part of it. The next phase, after we reported the results to everybody and back to DOE, and it became clear that the Aleuts, the state of Alaska, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA were not concerned about the radionuclides anymore. There was clearly no leakage. The next question became, well, so if we want to close this, how can we assure that this is going to continue? So they asked CREST to develop a biomonitoring plan, which we did, and then presented to everybody all over again. And then this plan was taken by long-term stewardship part of DOE and was almost used word for word. The interesting thing about developing a biomonitoring plan, DOE didn't object to how many species I thought they should do, because I picked species for the biomonitoring plan that represented Aleut foods of importance, NOAA species of importance, and species of biological importance. So it represented the food chain, what the Aleuts were interested in, and what the state of Alaska and NOAA were interested in. What they did object to was I said in the biomonitoring plan that I thought they should do this every 5 years, which they thought was too much, because it costs us the expedition, including the biological part and the physiological part. The whole thing cost us $3.8 million. It's not like, a cheap process. On the other hand, it allowed them to close Amchitka, which was a big thing. So having the data that you need is necessary. But the one thing that was the sticking point was monitoring every 5 years. In the end, that's what they decided to do, is monitor every 5 years. But I put a clause in there that said that if there was an earthquake of any magnitude in the region, that they needed to go back within 6 months and redo it to make sure. And that was the clause that they weren't sure that they should do, but they left it in anyway. And then, a few years after it, they went back and they were doing their monitoring. And a few years after that, in between the 5-year plans, there was a really severe earthquake there. And they did go back and it didn't leak. So that's very good. But it turns out it turns out that it's really important to try to think about what might happen in the future when you're developing biomonitoring plans, because given climate change, sea level rise, and earthquakes and storms like that, we really need to have contingencies for when it would be really critical to monitor and make sure that something hasn't leaked. So the main conclusions were that human foods are well below any published health guidance. There was a wide range of biota in the intertidal and benthic around Amchitka, and it was similar to Kiska, the control site. There were complex food webs that had to be considered, and our data did not suggest that radionuclides were a problem near Amchitka at all at the moment. Next. However, one of the things that I did was we had a lot of meetings with a lot of people. And this represents some of the meetings we had with the Aleuts before and after. And as I say, we went to many different villages. And at every village, I kept track. I'm compulsive about these things. I kept track of every question people asked. And when we went back after the expedition, I kept track of them. And what it showed basically is that before the expedition, people were somewhat worried about any kind of methods that might be used, and they were worried about, they didn't know much about CRESP, and they had some distrust of DOE and all that sort of thing. And afterwards, they were much more interested in the health effects because we had talked about it, and so they knew what kind of things they should always look for. They had no more questions about or hardly any about CRESP, almost none about the biological methods, because they had been there, they had done it, they had helped collect them, they were part of it. And instead they were now thinking about what's the ecological risk and what future concerns are there. So actually being part of it, it did take us longer to do the study because we went out, several different times to the Aleutians and so on. We talked to zillions of people next, but it's incredibly important because everybody, when I was out there, really felt that the Aleuts knew much more about this ecosystem than I did, and they were incredibly helpful in making sure we were safe, being able to collect things that I would never been able to know how to collect, and generally helping the expedition. They were just super terrific. And after the expedition, they were much less concerned about radiation and more concerned about mercury. I think we went back, and more concerned about mercury, because they had all been reading about mercury. Now, the DOE in no way had anything to do with any mercury contamination there, because they weren't using it at all in any way. So the mercury contamination, if there, was coming from other sources. But I did put in the proposal that I was going to collect samples to analyze for mercury and other contaminants because the people were interested in it, even though DOE was not funding that part. Next. So they continued to be interested in radionuclides. They were more interested in the effects of each of them, the health effects, than they were in the risk reduction. But as you can see, they had gotten much more worried about mercury and the foods. Next. So we got money from other sources and not connected with DOE to analyze the mercury in fish so that we could send that information back to them as well when we went, as well as the other, because they were much more interested in it. And it turns out that mercury in fish is a problem. Mercury in fish is a problem everywhere. It's a problem at many DOE sites, but it's largely a global problem because of power plants. Mercury is circulating in the atmosphere and comes out in rain. And it's really a worldwide problem. But they did get the information that they needed, because if people have information, they can make their own informed decisions about what to eat, depending upon whether they are or aren't going to get pregnant or have small children. Next. So we ended up with agreement among all the stakeholders and the tribes. Chitka was closed. We developed a biomonitoring plan, and it's now in a DOE legacy site. Next. And we selected the indicators, 5 things representing what the Aleuts wanted and what the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted. Next. And so in the end, it was a success. It was a lot of years. It sort of started in 2000, wasn't really done till 2006, all the way through. And as you can see, I have 3 middle gentlemen. Were Aleuts. The 3 top are my biological team. Steve Jewett was the head of the 3 diving people. Bob Patrick was a person from APIA, the Aleut Aleutian Pribilof Island Association, and Dan Volz was our logistics person. And I'm standing here in front of one of the churches. The Aleutian Islands have some of the most beautiful churches in the world. And each island has their own church. So that's it. And I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you immensely for taking your time to present to us today. This was a wonderful presentation.
This just shows there's a zillion publications, and Aleuts are on all of them because they were part of the research team. We don't need that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, these are great stuff to look into afterward. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions for our speaker.
I disappeared.
I'll start with one. So you mentioned that going into the plan for going to the Aleutian Islands, and that you started to go into it without at first including the tribes, but then you included more Aleutian members as the project progressed. If you were to kind of do that project again or approach a new site with different tribes, what would you do differently?
Well, there's 2 parts to your question. One is the way we handled it. The way in the case of the Aleutian Islands, it was the state of Alaska that had the responsibility for accepting or not accepting DOE closure. And so the state of Alaska and the governor was the one who said, we are not going to be happy with the DOE models only. We want a study conducted. So that's how it got started. Every case would be different. In some cases, the tribes have initiated things. In some cases, someone else initiates it. Everything has to be initiated some way. We don't actually sort of go out generally and do studies without somebody being interested in approaching us to do it. We do a lot of research on our own, but that's initiated by things that we think are important to do. Anybody else?
Hello, I have a quick question. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that the nuclear material could be brought to the surface, I guess, at different levels in the ocean.
Yeah.
Would bring that nuclear material to the surface? You mentioned that earthquakes might
Earthquake would be the biggest one. That if there was an earthquake and it fractured rocks, you wouldn't necessarily be able to predict where those fractures would occur. And there were very elaborate groundwater models that were doing that. And I forgot the exact time period, but their exact time period was something like, 50 years to 10,000 years they could leak. That's not helpful to the average person. First of all, it was already that long since the tests. And secondly, who can think in terms of 10,000 years, something might happen. So that was why with the biomonitoring plan, I really wanted to put in that if there was an earthquake, it needed to be checked, because that's the most likely thing that could happen. I mean, there could be a volcano, but that's not really as active as other places. I mean, there could be a volcano and that would have an effect, but you know, it's really right in the middle of the earthquake zone.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Joanna, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the research. So I know you take a lot of samples, and how did you determine the which background value, how to get background samples for those fishes and animals? What considerations you consider?
Okay, so the first thing was we had looked for what in the Aleutians would be a good control site. And so we were looking in that sense for what would be biologically similar, what might have the same fish and aquatic species and what might have the land species. The second consideration that was tricky was Kiska, which is closer to Russia, was the one that might be most like it biologically. And both of them had some US military activity, because Amchitka had been used as a military base during the war, and there had been some fighting on Kiska. So both of them had military action. The one fly that we were a little bit worried about was whether, because Kiska was closer to Russia, there might be some tests that we didn't know about that might differentially affect that. But when we looked at all the islands, there were those similar kind of questions with all of them. And then in terms of comparison, we used the places where people had been concerned enough about it to do studies, and it's not that many places where you can get radionuclide data, a range of radionuclide data on different species in the same marine system. Is why we use the Irish Sea. Is another good place to compare.
Thank you very much.
I can't actually say enough how in all of my experiences with working with Native Americans or Alaska Natives, it's always really important to remember that they know more about some things and you know more about other things. And if you can get to work together, it's really terrific. And that caring deeply, if both sides care deeply, you can find common ground to make it work.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much once again for coming and present to us. It was truly educational experience to learn all the processes that went up there, and a lot of things that we probably all don't consider every day in our.
This was one project where we started from beginning to end, and it's sort of a nice feeling to be able to be involved in it all along.
It's a full.
Well, everyone have a
full-time
nice day
line.
and stay safe.
So
Thank you.
Joanna, real quick, while everybody else is signing off, how do you define what a significant earthquake is in that sort of highly seismic area?
I don't have all that in front of me, but we did list something that
I mean, they have Cat 7s all the time, up to 9s since they did that. So it seems to me, what would be significant relative to, say, a Cat 9 that they had in 1964 in terms of shaking some of that stuff loose? That'd be very interesting. I need to go back and read that, because that'd be very interesting how to categorize that.
We may have, and there may be more earthquakes there now than there were at that time that has to be looked at. But they are going back every 5 years and sampling, and they did go back and look at it.
Well, and I think that would be part of the issue, would be if you said any earthquake there, you'd have to go monitor constantly. Yes. So the question is, what would be a significant earthquake? Is it a 7? Is it a 7.5?
Absolutely.
Is it a 9? I mean, because they actually have those there.
Means how close it is.
Well, and these things shake. I mean, you can have one not so close, but if the ground's just right, you can get the seismic event.
Yeah.
Quite a bit from the epicenter. So it's very interesting. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry, everyone. I was waiting until everybody else finished before I hit Joanna out, but that's it. Thank you.
Everybody have a nice day.
Thank you, Joanna.
As well.
Thanks, Joanna.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.